morning sunlight streamed softly through the glass doors of Waffle Haven, casting a warm golden hue across the floor. Daniel Carter, founder and owner of the wildly successful waffle shop chain with 15 locations across 3 states, walked into the restaurant wearing a simple jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. No one in the shop recognized that the man standing among them was the owner. Today, he wasn't here as the man at the top. There were no ribbon cuttings, no congratulatory handshakes, just a man quietly listening for the heartbeat of the very dream he had poured his youth into building. Waffle Haven wasn't just a restaurant chain, it was his dream. His belief in kindness and his commitment to service from the heart. But lately, the cold numbers and declining customer feedback seemed to be warning him of something far worse. "I need to see this with my own eyes," Daniel murmured, his voice laced with resolve as he stepped up to the counter. Mia, a young woman with a warm smile and bright eyes, greeted him with a cheerful tone, her words delivered with almost mechanical precision. "Welcome to Waffle Haven, where every bite feels like home." That slogan was his. Daniel had written it himself. Once. He truly believed that as long as his team held onto that spirit, everything would be fine. But today, beneath Mia's friendly smile, he could see something else. Weariness lurking at the edges of her eyes. "I'll have the heavenly stack with extra blueberries and a black coffee," Daniel said, keeping his voice casual. He paid with cash, avoiding anything that might give away who he really was. Choosing a quiet booth near the window, Daniel settled into a seat that gave him a clear view of both the open kitchen and the front counter. Memories flooded back. The early days, when this place was the cornerstone of his dream, built on hope, long hours, and the joy of watching customers smile over a hot plate of waffles. But that sense of comfort was quickly shattered. A heavy-set man with slicked-back hair, Rick Palmer, the location manager, lounged behind the counter with his phone in hand, barking orders at staff in a condescending tone. Daniel recognized him from personnel files, a recommendation from a senior regional supervisor. But everything about Rick's demeanor clashed violently with the culture Daniel had worked so hard to instill. Just then, 2 young employees emerged from the kitchen, carrying trays of fresh waffles. They paused near Daniel's booth, unaware their quiet conversation could be overheard. "You heard what happened to Ethan?" Mia whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "Yeah, he did the right thing," reported Rick, for skimming money from the till. "Now he's the one getting punished." Jordan, a tall, lean server beside her, replied through clenched teeth. Daniel froze. The pieces were starting to fit together, clearer than any internal report ever had. "Rick should have been fired, not Ethan," Jordan added. "All he did was tell the truth. Now he's stuck with the worst shifts and barely making enough to get by. Corporate said they'd look into it." Mia scoffed bitterly. "But nothing happened. I heard Rick has connections higher up." Daniel felt his heart sink. This wasn't just negligence. This was betrayal. Betrayal of the very values he had built his company upon. Integrity, gratitude, and belief in doing what's right. All of it trampled by people he had once trusted. Then came Ethan, dark circles under his eyes, hands trembling as he placed the towering plate of waffles in front of Daniel. "Enjoy your meal, sir," he said softly, his voice devoid of the spark Daniel had once encouraged in every team member. "Thanks." "Ethan," Daniel replied, deliberately using his name. He couldn't stop himself from asking, "You all right? You look really tired." Ethan flinched, surprised by the concern from a stranger. His eyes welled slightly, but he quickly masked it. "I'm fine, just working a double shift." Before he could say more, Rick's voice rang out from across the restaurant. "Ethan, stop chatting and clear table 7, then get back to the stock room." The atmosphere in the shop seemed to freeze. Daniel clenched his fist beneath the table, his breathing heavier. A storm was rising within him, and it wouldn't end at this booth. Rick's next command echoed harshly from the kitchen. "Mop the back," Jason called out again. Ethan didn't argue. He just nodded silently, his already slumped shoulders drooping even further. "Yes, sir. Right away." His voice was flat, mechanical, and then he vanished into the back, swallowed by exhaustion. Daniel took another bite of his waffle, still as delicious as he remembered. But the taste was dull now, soured by everything he had just seen. The culture he had sacrificed for, the sleepless nights, the tears, the faith, was being twisted into something cruel and transactional. Rick, meanwhile, continued his little kingdom of cruelty. He barely lifted a finger, yet relished every opportunity to demean Ethan. Every pass-by, a new insult. Every task completed, another critique. His eyes gleamed, not with pride, but with the pleasure of control. And then came the final insult. A group of suited executives entered. Daniel's breath caught when he recognized one of them, James Hoffman, the regional director he had personally entrusted with oversight. Rick sprang to attention like a trained dog, smoothing his shirt, fixing his hair, then rushing over with the charm of a polished host. He ushered the guests to the VIP table, ordered complimentary pastries, and played the part perfectly. Daniel watched, disgusted. When Hoffman clapped Rick on the back like an old buddy, everything clicked. This was why the investigation into Ethan's report had gone nowhere. The corruption ran deep, and it was protected. Daniel had believed delegation was necessary for growth. But what he'd built wasn't a legacy. It was a hollow brand, propped up by men who used his name to justify abuse. Then, the sound of shattering plates tore through the restaurant. Ethan stood frozen in horror as a stack of dishes slipped from his hands and crashed to the floor. Rick was on him instantly. "That's coming out of your paycheck, you worthless." "It was an accident," Mia cried, rushing to help. "Did I ask for your opinion?" Rick barked back. "Get back to the register before I write you up too." The executives didn't flinch, didn't even glance over. They laughed, sipped coffee, and returned to their discussion. Daniel could barely contain himself. His breath was short, his hands shook. This wasn't just a staffing issue, it wasn't a management failure. It was right. He took one last sip of coffee, left a generous tip marked, "For Ethan. Thank you for still being kind." And as he stood to leave, he made a decision. Tomorrow, Daniel Carter would disappear. A new name would appear on the job application. Dan Miller, a man recently laid off, just trying to get back on his feet. The game was about to change, and Rick had no idea who he was really dealing with. The game was about to change. But Rick and men like him had no idea. Before leaving, Daniel paused for a moment. Through the glass window, he saw Ethan picking up shards of broken ceramic, his hands trembling, eyes heavy with exhaustion. Daniel clenched his fist. "Just a little longer. Justice is coming," he whispered, as if making a silent vow to the universe. 3 days later, Daniel looked at himself in the mirror. Gone was the polished business owner in a tailored suit and luxury watch. Standing before him was Dan Miller, wearing a cheap plastic watch, a basic company uniform, and a plain cloth cap pulled low over his messy hair. The transformation was complete. Getting the job was almost too easy. Rick barely glanced at his resume for more than 10 seconds. They were short-staffed, and Daniel had crafted a convincing employment history with just enough food service experience to avoid suspicion. Behind the counter, Mia walked him through a brief orientation, her voice apologetic and eyes filled with concern. "Rick doesn't like us spending too much time on training," she said quietly. "Just follow me today, and you'll pick things up." During the morning shift, Daniel silently observed. Rick rarely left his office, only stepping out occasionally to complain or schmooze with certain customers, mostly business people who seemed very familiar with him. After a busy rush, when the cash drawer filled up, Rick made a show of meticulously counting bills, but Daniel saw everything. Rick's fingers moved suspiciously fast, and he always angled his body just enough to stay out of the camera's line of sight. The pieces were starting to fall into place like a puzzle. But Daniel knew that to take down a rotten system, it would take more than isolated clues. He needed time. He needed the trust of those being trampled. And most of all, he had to stay deep in character. Because now, justice was no longer just a promise. It was a mission. Around noon, Ethan walked into the shop, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep, his movements sluggish as if carrying the weight of the world. Without a word, he clocked in and immediately started restocking supplies, moving with the mechanical precision of someone long conditioned to do so. From across the room, Dan Miller, watched him with a complex mixture of empathy, sorrow, and rising anger. Rick appeared from behind suddenly, slapping a heavy hand on Daniel's shoulder. "New guy, huh? Dan, right? You'll be shadowing Ethan today. Kid knows all the grunt work better than anyone else." The way Rick emphasized grunt work made it clear this wasn't a neutral assignment. It was a jab disguised as a smile. Ethan said nothing, but Daniel noticed the brief clench in his jaw, a reflex born of humiliation and long-standing bitterness. As they organized the storeroom together, Daniel began carefully building rapport. He shared fabricated stories of past jobs, of being fired, struggling to pay rent, stories designed to mirror what he suspected Ethan was going through. "How long you been at Waffle Haven?" Daniel asked casually, as they hauled boxes of waffle mix. "Almost 2 years," Ethan replied, not stopping his work. "I was on track to become assistant manager. But whatever. Doesn't matter now." Daniel wanted to ask more, but stopped. In Ethan's eyes was the quiet resignation of someone whose belief in fairness had long since died. Their conversation was cut short when Rick called Ethan away to help with a surprise health inspection. Seizing the opportunity, Daniel accessed the inventory tablet in the storeroom, often ignored during day-to-day operations. It only took a few taps to confirm his suspicion. Reported inventory numbers didn't match reality. Products were going missing in a calculated, systemic pattern. Later that afternoon, the regional director arrived dressed in a designer suit and trailing a cloud of cologne. Rick practically flew out of his office as if summoned by magic, transforming instantly into the perfect host. They shook hands, exchanged practiced smiles, and disappeared into the back office, blinds snapping shut. "Watch this," Mia whispered, pretending to wipe down a nearby table. "Give it 20 minutes. They'll come out, find some minor issue with Ethan, and dump all the blame on him." And like clockwork, 23 minutes later, Rick and Hoffman emerged, faces smug with satisfaction. They paced the restaurant, whispering and jotting notes. When they reached the section Ethan had just finished mopping, Hoffman suddenly dragged his polished shoe across the floor, leaving a conspicuous mark. "Ethan!" Rick barked like a drill sergeant. Ethan looked up from the napkin station, face draining of color when he saw Hoffman. "You call this clean?" Rick shouted. "Just finished that area," Ethan stammered. "Not good enough," Hoffman cut in coldly. "This kind of mediocrity is exactly why you're still at entry level after 2 years. Daniel clenched his fist until his knuckles turned white. The urge to blow his cover surged through him, but he knew, revealing himself now would destroy everything. No one would believe the new guy without irrefutable proof. As Hoffman prepared to leave, Daniel caught Rick slipping a small envelope into his inner jacket pocket. A motion so swift most wouldn't have noticed. But Daniel wasn't most people. This was no longer suspicion. It was clear-cut corruption. After Hoffman left, Rick returned to the floor more aggressive than ever, strutting like a self-proclaimed king, micromanaging everyone except one, Jordan. Danielle noticed Jordan was treated noticeably better. No criticism, no heavy tasks. "He's the snitch," Mia murmured when she got a moment beside Daniel. reports anything people say about Rick. That's how he found out Ethan talked to corporate. As the shift neared its end, Rick theatrically checked the schedule, using it like a weapon. "You back here tomorrow morning, 5 a.m. sharp." No warning, no regard for the fact Ethan had just closed the previous night. Just a cold, merciless order, like he wasn't a human being, just a tool to be used and discarded. Daniel watched as Ethan nodded, hollow-eyed and silent, his soul beaten down one shift at a time. But inside Daniel, a fire burned hotter than ever. Time was running out, and justice was drawing closer with every breath. Out in the parking lot, Daniel stood beside his car window, watching as Rick stepped out with a smug grin, casually walking over to a brand new luxury SUV. A vehicle no single manager at a modest restaurant could possibly afford on a legitimate salary. Daniel clenched his fist, his fingers trembling slightly as he slid the key into the ignition. He didn't need more proof to know exactly what he was up against, but what he needed was undeniable, unshakable evidence. And the plan began to take shape. Rick and Hoffman thought they were manipulating a bunch of powerless employees. What they didn't know was that among them now stood someone far from ordinary, the very founder of the brand they were exploiting for profit. Over the next week, Daniel fully immersed himself in the role of Dan Miller, the humble new hire, eager, hard-working, and willing to do anything without complaint. He arrived early, stayed late, mopped floors, took out the trash, scrubbed pans, and swept the kitchen, all to build the image of someone forgettable, someone not worth noticing. But in silence, he observed, each passing hour revealed more of Ethan's slow deterioration. His skin paler, eyes darker, his thin frame looking even more fragile. Rick had carefully crafted Ethan's schedule to total nearly 60 hours a week while avoiding overtime pay, a legal but morally bankrupt loophole. One night, after closing when it was just the two of them cleaning the kitchen, Daniel found the right moment to speak. "You're really good at this," he said gently, as if making a casual observation. "If it were up to me, you'd be running this place, not stuck with all the worst shifts." Ethan let out a dry laugh, one devoid of joy. "I used to think that too. Then I learned the hard way. Honesty isn't exactly appreciated around here." Daniel met his eyes. "You mean the thing with the register?" Ethan froze. His eyes widened, guarded. "How do you know about that?" "I've worked at enough places," Daniel replied, as if recalling a distant memory. "When the numbers don't add up, the stock never gets checked, and the cash drawer is always counted alone. There's usually something off." A brief silence passed, and then Ethan nodded, as if a long-forgotten trust had been gently nudged back to life. He began to speak, voice low but clear. "It started small, just $20, then more. I noticed because my drawer always came up short. I didn't want to get blamed, so I started logging everything. Eventually, I reported it to corporate." Daniel tilted his head. "Just like the employee handbook says, right?" "Exactly," Ethan replied with a bitter smile. "I even had photo proof. Caught Rick pocketing cash. Thought I was doing the right thing, and instead of being thanked, I got demoted, lost my shot at promotion, and got stuck with all the worst shifts. Rick met with Hoffman the next day. That's when I knew I was no longer protected." Daniel sat beside him, anger burning in his chest. "But why? Why would they cover for a thief?" Ethan lowered his gaze, his voice dropping further. "Because Rick's not the only one getting paid. It's not just a few bucks in his pocket. That money, it goes higher. All the way to regional." Daniel nodded slowly. The picture was complete. A streamlined kickback system. Store managers skim cash, falsify inventory reports, and funnel a cut up to the regional director. Corruption as a business model, and only the decent workers paid the price. "I started collecting evidence," Ethan said, voice shaking. I was going to send it straight to the founder if I had to, but I think Jordan saw messages on my phone. That's how they found out. Before Daniel could respond, Rick swung open the office door and strolled out, looking satisfied. "You two still hanging around? Clock out already. I'm not paying you to loiter." Daniel stood up, suppressing the rising anger in his chest. But deep down he knew the battle had just begun. In the following days, Daniel quietly expanded his investigation. He volunteered for trash duty to access discarded receipts, helped with inventory counts to document discrepancies, and used a micro camera hidden in his shirt button to capture every shred of evidence before Rick could alter anything. Each photo was a blade, each data point a crack in the carefully constructed facade of a corrupt system, and with every passing hour, every recorded detail, Daniel drew closer to the moment of truth. A moment from which none of them would be able to escape. The micro camera, cleverly disguised as a shirt button on Daniel's uniform, recorded every detail invisible to the naked eye, and what it captured was worse than he had feared. Rick wasn't just skimming cash, he was manipulating the inventory too. He marked premium ingredients as spoiled, only to sell them like new and pocket the proceeds. Vendor invoices were forged to reflect inflated prices, the excess going straight into Rick's personal account. But the most alarming part, after weeks of tracking patterns, Daniel confirmed that at least 30% of the embezzled money was being passed along to Hoffman during his so-called surprise inspections. During a rare break in the cramped employee lounge, Daniel sat down with Mia and Jordan. In his usual mild-mannered new guy tone, he asked, "Does Rick treat everyone the way he treats Ethan?" Jordan stiffened immediately, eyes narrowing. "Rick runs a tight ship. Not everyone can handle discipline." Mia shot him a furious glare. "Discipline? He's a bully. He steals from the company and makes our lives miserable. The only reason you defend him is because you're his little informant." "That's not true," Jordan muttered, face flushing bright red. He stood abruptly and stormed out of the room. As the door clicked shut, Mia sighed. "He's not a bad guy. He's just scared. His mom's really sick and needs expensive medication. Rick promised him extra shifts if he kept reporting what people say." That afternoon, as Daniel walked past Rick's office, he overheard a tense phone call. "I don't care what Carter wants," Rick snapped. "Tell him everything's fine. That's what we're reporting." Then a pause. "No, Hoffman, listen to me. If Carter starts visiting stores in person, we're screwed." Daniel froze. He had heard his name, clear as day. The rot didn't stop with Hoffman. Someone inside headquarters was feeding them updates on his movements. The betrayal ran deeper than he had ever imagined. The perfect chance to act came when he learned about the weekend's special promotion, the anniversary celebration of the first Waffle Haven store. Rick was practically drooling at the prospect of all those cash transactions. The perfect storm for another major theft. On Friday night, after Rick left, Daniel returned to the restaurant using a key he had secretly duplicated. He replaced the fake security system with an identical-looking real one, equipped to record and upload footage to his private server. He dusted a thin layer of UV powder onto the safe's dial and handle. Large denomination bills in the register were marked with nearly invisible fluorescent ink. Every move was calculated, every gesture as precise as a covert mission. The trap was set. Now all that remained was for Rick to walk right into it. As he stepped out the back door, Daniel felt a deep stillness settle inside him. The storm was coming, but this time he wasn't alone. He had the truth. He had the evidence, and, most of all, he had a reason. Saturday morning, the sky was clear, sunlight soft, and the air full of energy. A perfect day for a celebration. Waffle Haven was festively decorated, colorful balloons, a large banner over the entrance that read, 7 years of waffle happiness. Daniel arrived early. All the surveillance equipment remained untouched. No one had noticed a thing. The trap was set. All that was left was to wait. Rick showed up shortly after, buzzing like a bloodhound catching the scent of cash. He paced around, barking orders, shouting that corporate might be sending someone to inspect the store. Daniel stood off to the side and smiled to himself. "Oh, they're coming," he thought, "sooner than you think." By 9 a.m., the restaurant was packed. A line of customers stretched out the door. The registers rang non-stop. The kitchen roared with activity. It was exactly the kind of controlled chaos Rick wanted. Just enough to hide the theft under layers of distraction. Rick kept returning to the register, pretending to help, but Daniel tracked every move, watching as Rick's hands moved too fast over large bills, making a few of them vanish like they'd never existed. Around 11 a.m., Ethan arrived for his midday shift. His eyes were bloodshot, his walk more unsteady than the day before. It was clear he hadn't gotten much sleep after closing the night before. "You're late," Rick shouted, even though Daniel's watch showed Ethan was 2 minutes early. "Sorry," Ethan mumbled, fumbling with his apron, his hands trembling. "Go to register 2, Mia's on break. And don't mess up the count this time." Daniel watched Ethan shuffle to the counter like a ghost. He was hanging on by a thread. But was today the day that thread finally snapped? The lunch rush hit like a tsunami, easily triple the usual volume. Amid the chaos, Daniel stayed focused. Everything was unfolding just as he'd planned. Everything was under control, but what he hadn't accounted for was the human heart and the breaking point of a soul pushed to the edge. That day would change everything. From the moment the doors opened, Waffle Haven overflowed with customers. The anniversary promotion had drawn back patrons who hadn't visited in years, lured in by nostalgia and discounted menu items. Under normal circumstances, Daniel would have felt proud. But today, all he felt was a heavy divide between the beautiful memories and the dirty truth he was about to expose. As the crowd surged, Daniel served waffles with one hand while tracking Rick with the other, a man growing bolder by the hour. At one point, Rick casually pulled out an entire stack of $20 bills under the guise of rearranging the drawer, then loudly declared, "Register 2 is balanced." Ethan tried to keep it that way. Ethan said nothing. His face flushed red, not from embarrassment, but from the simmering rage of someone repeatedly humiliated. Still, he bowed his head and endured, just as he always had. At 2 p.m., Hoffman arrived, dressed sharp, smooth-talking but with calculating eyes. He made the rounds, shaking hands, offering praise to staff in a tone that sounded warm but felt rehearsed. When he reached Ethan, his voice shifted. "Syrup dispensers aren't quite full, are they? Carter always said. The details matter. Did you forget?" Then, as if it were scripted, Hoffman and Rick vanished into the office. Daniel, pretending to count supplies in the back, checked his phone. The hidden camera on his uniform streamed it all. Rick pulling cash from his pocket, counting it, stuffing it into an envelope. Hoffman slipping it into his jacket without blinking. Every clip, every detail, Daniel recorded meticulously, and while the evidence thrilled him, a knot of worry twisted in his gut as he watched Ethan, visibly collapsing under the weight of exhaustion. The young man hadn't stopped moving since his shift began, taking orders, manning the register, running food, all without a single break. At 4 p.m., disaster struck. Ethan was carrying a large tray of anniversary waffles. As he passed Rick, his foot caught slightly, just enough to stumble. Nothing spilled. He recovered immediately. But Rick pounced. "You drunk? Or just useless?" Rick bellowed, loud enough for everyone to hear. Ethan gripped the tray tighter, lips pressed so hard they bled. "No, sir. I just haven't had a break in 7 hours." "You want a break? Do your job well, and maybe you'll earn one." From across the restaurant, Daniel saw it in Ethan's eyes. The threshold had been crossed. An hour later, with the crowd thinning, Ethan quietly wiped down tables. Rick and Hoffman approached, faces grave with manufactured concern. "We need to talk about your performance today." Rick announced loudly, ensuring the few remaining customers could hear. "Errors in the drawer, slow service, and now I'm getting complaints about your attitude." "What complaints?" Ethan asked, drained. "I've been polite to everyone." "Oh, so now you're calling me a liar?" Rick sneered, tapping his pocket. "I have written statements right here." Daniel knew those statements didn't exist. Hoffman nodded solemnly. "Customer experience is Mr. Carter's top priority, and that was the final straw." Ethan stopped wiping. His eyes, once dim with exhaustion, now burned with something else. Clarity. "Dude, I said, that's enough." Rick's face contorted. "What did you just say to me?" "I said, that's enough," Ethan repeated, louder now. "There have never been any customer complaints. Never. You're just looking for an excuse to fire me without paying unemployment." All action in the restaurant ceased. Customers and staff froze mid-movement. The only sound was the faint drip of the coffee machine behind the counter. "You're fired," Rick exploded. "Get out of here, now." "No need," Ethan said calmly. He untied his apron and folded it neatly on the nearest table. "I quit." Then, turning to face Hoffman, his voice unwavering, "I used to believe Waffle Haven stood for something, for honesty and hard work. I admired Mr. Carter, but now, this place is a joke, a hollow shell hiding corruption." And with that, Ethan turned and walked out, head held high for the first time in 2 years, his steps lighter than they'd ever been. Daniel watched him go, heart swelling with pride, admiration, and silent grief. Ethan had done the right thing, but at a steep cost. He had no new job lined up, no income, just his dignity, still intact. That night, Daniel stayed in his car, watching from a distance. As he had predicted, once the staff had gone home, Rick returned alone. From the hidden camera feed, Daniel saw him open the safe, count stack after stack of cash, and stuff it into a duffel bag. UV powder now covered his hands, and the marked bills Daniel had planted were nestled safely inside that bag. Every piece of evidence, images, receipts, recordings, financial data, was complete. Tomorrow would be Judgment Day. Daniel started his car and followed Rick. But in his mind, it wasn't just about bringing down a criminal. It was also about a promise, a quiet vow. He would find Ethan, because that young man deserved to be protected by justice. And maybe he deserved a second chance. Everything was in place. The evidence had been meticulously compiled into a digital presentation. Hidden camera footage, doctored invoices, financial discrepancies, marked bills, UV traces, all backed up to a secure private server. There was no room for denial. The time to act had arrived. No longer Dan Miller, the quiet new hire. That morning, Daniel Carter walked into Waffle Haven in a sharp, tailored suit, his posture confident, his expression calm but piercing. The morning staff didn't recognize him at first. They did double and triple takes before realizing that the man who had worked alongside them all week was the owner himself. "Good morning," Daniel said politely, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Please tell Rick I need to see him immediately. And let everyone on today's shift know we're having an emergency staff meeting in 30 minutes. Sorry, but who should I say is asking for him?" The cashier stammered, clearly shaken by his commanding presence. Daniel smiled, eyes still fixed on the counter. "Tell him the owner is here." In that instant, the young woman's world seemed to freeze. She trembled as she picked up the phone. Moments later, Rick emerged from his office, hair disheveled, face pale beneath a forced smile. "Mr. Carter, we weren't expecting you today." "If I'd known, I would have." Daniel raised a hand to cut him off. His voice wasn't loud, but it silenced the room instantly. "No need for preparation, Rick. Just gather the staff, conference room, 30 minutes. Rick nodded awkwardly, fumbling with his phone to call off-shift employees, swallowing hard between breaths. Meanwhile, Daniel walked through each section of the restaurant, discreetly checking the surveillance devices he had installed. Everything remained untouched. No one had caught on. He removed every last trace of the role he had played. His final act. By 9 a.m., the conference room was packed. Mia, Jordan, and the familiar staff members sat in tense silence, their eyes darting nervously between Rick and Daniel. Something big was about to happen. They could feel it. The door opened again. Hoffman entered, still in a crisp suit, but missing his usual swagger. He forced a smile, which disappeared the moment he locked eyes with Daniel. Daniel stepped forward, facing the entire team. He wasn't the distant owner or corporate bigwig anymore. He was himself, the man who had started from scratch, scrubbed floors, worked the grill, and built Waffle Haven with his own hands. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Daniel began. "Some of you know me as Daniel Carter, the founder and owner of Waffle Haven. But others of you," he looked toward the faces of those who had worked beside him all week. Ethan was absent, but his presence still lingered, like a shadow in the room. "Know me by another name?" Dan Miller, the new hire. A ripple of shock spread through the room. Mia gasped, covering her mouth. Jordan went pale. Rick and Hoffman could no longer hide their fear. Daniel didn't pause. "This past week, I worked alongside you. I mopped floors, carried trays, scrubbed pans. But more importantly, I observed, I listened, I witnessed." He tapped the screen on his tablet. The wall-mouth monitor lit up, showing footage of Rick pocketing cash from the register. Another clip played, Rick counting money in his office and passing it to Hoffman, who slipped it into an envelope and tucked it into his inner jacket pocket. "This footage is from yesterday's anniversary promotion," Daniel stated clearly. "And this," the screen split, displaying financial records alongside inventory logs. Key discrepancies highlighted in red, "is proof of a systematic embezzlement scheme. From falsified invoices and manipulated stock reports to schedule tampering to avoid paying overtime. All of it carefully orchestrated for the past 18 months. Daniel paused, his gaze locked on Rick. "The total amount stolen from this location is $157,000.00. Rick sprang from his chair. "That's not true. You don't have any." "Sit down, Rick," Daniel said sharply, his voice like steel. "I have all the evidence, including the marked bills with UV ink, which are currently in Mr. Hoffman's possession." The screen displayed photos of the specially tagged cash, matching exactly with the money found in Hoffman's private safe the night before. Daniel took a breath. His voice softened, but the authority in it never wavered. "But what disappoints me the most isn't the money." He turned to address the entire team, his voice now that of a leader, a protector, even a father figure. "It's how you treated my people, especially those who had the courage to stand up for what's right." He looked directly at Hoffman. "When Ethan Mercer reported suspicious activity, following the exact steps outlined in our employee handbook, he wasn't praised. He wasn't protected. Instead, he was demoted, overworked, and forced out of this place." A heavy silence fell over the room. No one spoke. No one dared to look away. Only one thing remained: justice. "You didn't follow proper investigation protocol," Daniel continued, eyes fixed on Hoffman. "Instead, you and Rick conspired to punish Ethan, to demote him, and to push him to the brink. Why? Because he dared to threaten your little cash machine?" Hoffman stood abruptly, trying to salvage what dignity he had left. "Mr. Carter, I think there may have been a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding, James," Daniel cut in, voice low but unyielding. He placed a USB drive on the table. "This contains everything. including phone call recordings between you and Rick, where you discuss how to hide the theft, how to deceive me, and how to warn each other whenever I planned a surprise visit. Rick, now realizing the curtain had been fully pulled back, shifted his tone. We weren't the only ones. There are others higher up in corporate. We were just following orders. I know. Daniel responded firmly. I've investigated all the way to headquarters. But today, I'm not here to talk to them. Today, I'm talking to the people in this room. The ones who suffered because of you. He turned and looked around the room, where every employee sat in silence, waiting for his next words. Effective immediately, Rick Palmer and James Hoffman are terminated from Waffle Haven. Security is waiting outside to escort them from the premises. Law enforcement has received the full case file, and I've signed off on criminal charges. As if it had been scripted, 2 uniformed officers entered the conference room. Rick's devastated expression was rivaled only by the stunned looks on the employees' faces. Hoffman jumped to his feet. You can't do this! You have no idea who you're messing with! Daniel turned to him, his face cold and unflinching. No, I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and I've already spoken to the board this morning. The people you thought would protect you, they've already cut ties to save themselves. The officers stepped forward, reading the Miranda rights as Rick and Hoffman were quietly led away. The door closed behind them, leaving behind a silence thick with emotion. But in that silence, something greater had begun. Daniel took a deep breath and faced the staff. I'll owe you all an apology. I didn't see what was happening in my own company. That changes today. He walked toward Mia, her eyes wide with disbelief. Mia, thank you for speaking up, even when it put your job at risk. Then he turned to Jordan, who still looked down in shame. Jordan, I understand your situation with your mother's health. Instead of letting you go, I want to give you a chance to make things right. We'll talk and we'll find a way forward together. And so, Daniel addressed each employee by name, listening to them not as a distant CEO, but as someone who had once stood in that same kitchen, who understood what it was like to be trapped by an uncaring system. By the end of the meeting, the tension had lifted. Hope began to take root, something they hadn't felt in a long time. But Daniel knew one task remained, more important than all the rest. As Mia was about to leave, Daniel stopped her. Mia, could you give me Ethan's address? I need to see him. The apartment complex was a row of weathered brick buildings in the outskirts of the town that was completely deserted. He stepped out of the car and peeked inside, and humble, tired. He turned to his Horse Humidity Unit 3B. He knocked. Ethan opened the door, clearly shocked. In front of him stood the man who had once worked beside him, and who was also the founder of the very company he had once believed in. Daniel Carter. Mr. Carter, or Dan, I don't understand, Ethan stammered, still in rumpled pajamas, unable to mask his confusion. May I come in? Daniel asked gently. There's something we need to talk about. Ethan nodded and stepped aside, revealing a modest living room with mismatched furniture, a few job applications spread across the table, and a laptop still open on a job search site. Daniel sat down on the worn couch and exhaled. First, an apology, but more than that, a thank you. For the next 15 minutes, Daniel told Ethan everything. The undercover operation, the evidence collected, the arrests, the fall of a corrupt system. Ethan listened silently, his expression shifting from doubt to cautious hope to overwhelming relief. Rick and Hoffman actually got arrested? Ethan asked, still unsure he believed it. They did, and 3 corporate executives are being prosecuted as well, Daniel confirmed. Ethan shook his head, eyes welling up. For 2 years, I thought maybe I imagined it, that I was overreacting. They made me doubt my own mind. That's how toxic systems survive, Daniel said softly. They make the honest people feel like they're the problem. But at Waffle Haven, from now on, that stops. Ethan lowered his head, as if a burden had finally been lifted. I guess I should thank you for coming, he said, starting to rise. I guess I should thank you for coming. I guess I should thank you for coming, he said, starting to rise. I guess I should thank you for coming, he said. I should. Daniel held his gaze and smiled. I didn't just come to apologize, Ethan. I came to invite you back. Ethan blinked, confused. Daniel stood. I want you to return to Waffle Haven, not as an employee, but as assistant regional manager. Full salary. Full authority to help rebuild what was broken. You deserve that. Because you were the first to stand up and do the right thing. For the first time in years, Ethan no longer had to force himself to stand tall. He was standing on solid ground, on the very values he once feared would be buried forever. And this was only the beginning. Daniel slowly reached into the inner pocket of his custom-tailored coat. Every motion was deliberate, respectful, honest. He pulled out an envelope and placed it gently on the coffee table. I didn't come here just to apologize, Daniel said, his voice low but unwavering. I came for a more personal reason. Ethan looked at the envelope, cautious. The wounds of betrayal hadn't healed, and trust didn't come easily anymore. What is it? He asked, still guarded. An opportunity, Daniel replied. An invitation, but not to your old job. Ethan opened the envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper. His expression changed from confusion to shock to disbelief. Assistant manager, Ethan whispered. Daniel nodded. And a clear path to regional manager within 1 year, if you want it. The room was silent. Ethan read each line carefully, until he saw the salary figure. It was more than double what he had ever earned. He looked up, eyes wide. This is real? He asked, voice breaking. It's real, Daniel confirmed. The store needs someone with integrity, with courage, someone who knows right from wrong and has the strength to act on it. I don't just need someone who's good at the job, Ethan. I need someone who lives the values. Ethan clutched the envelope tightly. His shoulders trembled, as if holding back a wave of emotion. Maybe it was relief. Maybe it was the long-awaited feeling that justice wasn't just a dream. I don't know what to say, he whispered. You don't need to say anything, Daniel said. Just think about it. The store reopens on Monday. Ethan nodded, his eyes no longer full of hesitation. In that moment, Daniel knew they had closed a painful chapter and opened a new one, filled with hope, integrity, and rebirth. Daniel stood and adjusted his tie. I believe in you. That's what matters most. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Ethan sitting alone in the modest room, the job offers still in his hands, his eyes gazing out the window, where the afternoon sun poured in like a quiet sign that everything had truly changed, not just for Ethan, but for anyone who ever believed that kindness was weakness.